Imagine having all the wisdom in the world and still losing it all. Solomon, the wisest king in the Bible, received from God a gift that changed history, boundless wisdom. Kings and queens traveled entire continents just to hear him. He wrote proverbs that still transform lives today and built the most glorious temple ever seen. But there is something about Solomon's biblical story that few know about. Something that explains why such prepared people sometimes make the most destructive choices of their lives. Why did someone who had everything end up seeing his own kingdom fragment? And more importantly, what does this have to do with the decisions you make today? Who was Solomon in the Bible goes far beyond what you imagine. This is a story about wisdom, choices, and consequences that may be repeating itself in your life right now. Stay until the end, because there is a revelation about this story of King Solomon that can completely change the way you view wisdom and success. Jerusalem, almost 3,000 years ago, in the corridors of the royal palace, a boy grew up under the weight of an extraordinary promise. Solomon's biblical story, it began long before he became king. It began with a prophecy that would define not only his life, but the fate of an entire nation. Son of King David, the man after God's own heart, Solomon carried in his veins the lineage of giants of faith, but he also carried something heavier, the divine expectation to be different, to be special. His very name meant peaceful, a promise that his kingdom would be marked by peace, not war as his father's had been. As a child, Solomon saw his father consulting God before every important decision. He saw the prophets coming and going from the palace, bringing words from the Almighty. He grew up knowing that serving God was not optional for a king of Israel. It was a matter of national survival. But what no one imagined was that who was Solomon in the Bible would be defined not only by his achievements, but also by his choices. Choices that began very early, when he had not even dreamed of the throne he would inherit. God had plans for that boy. Plans that included unparalleled wisdom, unimaginable wealth, and a test that would reveal whether the human heart can endure so many blessings without becoming corrupted. The question that would echo throughout his life was already being written. What happens when God gives someone everything the world desires? The moment had arrived. The old King David was about to depart, and Solomon, still young, felt the weight of the crown he was about to receive. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what was to come. King Solomon's wisdom was not yet a reality. It was just a hope in a heart that desperately sought divine guidance. On that silent night in Gibeon, after offering 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord, Solomon lay down with a prayer in his heart. The air was heavy with the smoke of sacrifices, and the stars seemed silent witnesses to a moment that would change history. Then the impossible happened. "Ask me for whatever you want me to give you," God said in a dream. Imagine yourself in this situation, the creator of the universe offering to grant your every wish. Wealth, power, fame, revenge on your enemies. Solomon could have asked for anything, but his words revealed something extraordinary about his character. "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil." This answer pleased the Lord so much that he decided to give not only wisdom, but also wealth and honor such as have never been equaled. Divine wisdom of Solomon was born at that moment, but a responsibility was also born that few would understand. When Solomon awoke, something had changed forever, not just in his mind, but in his soul. He now carried a gift that would make kings and queens cross deserts just to hear it. But he also carried a burden, how to use such wisdom without becoming its slave. 2 women, 1 baby, a decision that would define a king's reputation forever. The first great demonstration of wisdom of Solomon in the Bible, it didn't happen in a golden throne room, but in the face of a situation that seemed impossible to resolve. Both claimed to be the child's mother. There were no witnesses, no evidence, Just two desperate women and an innocent baby at the center of a dispute that would test all the wisdom God had given the young king. What Solomon did in that moment echoed down the centuries. "Bring me a sword," he ordered. "Divide the living child in two and give half to each." The silence was deafening until one of the women, tears in her eyes, cried out, "No! Give the baby to her, but don't kill it." The other, cold, replied, "Let it be divided." At that moment, the wisest king in the Bible had revealed not only who the real mother was, but something profound about human nature. True love would rather lose everything than see the beloved suffer. News of this decision spread like wildfire, and something extraordinary happened. Queens left their kingdoms to come hear him. Merchants changed caravan routes just to pass through Jerusalem. Scribes traveled for months to record his words. Solomon proverbs and wisdom began to transform not just Israel, but entire nations. But amid all this glory, a small seed was being planted, a seed that would grow into their greatest trial. 7 years, 180,000 workers. Stones cut without the sound of hammer or axe. Construction of Solomon's temple. It was not just an architectural work, it was the materialization of a dream that David carried in his heart, but that God reserved for the hands of his son. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe for more life-changing Bible stories. Now, stay with me on this extraordinary journey. The temple rose like a golden mountain in the heart of Jerusalem. Cedars from Lebanon perfumed the air, while the purest gold lined every wall. But what made this place truly special was not its external beauty. It was the presence of God who would dwell there. On the day of dedication, something supernatural happened. The glory of the Lord filled the temple so much that even the priests could not stand to minister. Solomon, before all the people, raised his hands to heaven and prayed a prayer that would echo through the centuries. Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Solomon's kingdom became the center of the known world. Gold flowed like water. Wisdom was exported like a precious commodity, and peace reigned from Dan to Beersheba. No neighboring kingdom dared declare war on Israel. It was as if God had created on earth a piece of heaven itself. But amidst such glory, Solomon began making decisions that seemed small at the time, but carried gigantic consequences. Decisions about alliances, relationships, and commitments. Decisions that would reveal a disturbing truth. Even the greatest wisdom in the world can be insufficient when the heart begins to stray from its first love. Every empire is built on choices, and Solomon and his choices began to shape not only their own destiny, but the future of an entire nation. To human eyes, their decisions seemed strategic, intelligent, even necessary. But in God's eyes, something different was happening. The first choice seemed insignificant, a political alliance with Egypt, sealed through marriage to Pharaoh's daughter. It was common diplomacy at the time. Kings did this to ensure peace and prosperity. Solomon, with all his wisdom, surely knew what he was doing, didn't he? After all, God himself had given him discernment to judge between good and evil. But then came the second alliance, and the third, and the fourth. Each political marriage brought not only a new queen, but new gods, new customs, new influences. Solomon's palace began to resemble a Tower of Babel more than the home of a king who served the God of Israel. Solomon's examples and errors began to pile up like small stones in an avalanche. Individually, each decision could be justified. Collectively, they were building something dangerous, something that even their extraordinary wisdom couldn't clearly see. The man who had discerned between two mothers was gradually losing the ability to discern right from wrong in his own life. The wisdom that had impressed the world was failing to protect him from himself. And the worst was yet to come, because when a wise heart begins to stray, the consequences are proportional to the depth of the fall. 700 princesses, 300 concubines. Solomon and his foreign wives represented something far greater than impressive numbers or displays of royal power. They represented the materialization of a trap that had been prophesied centuries before. God had been clear in Scripture. You shall not take wives from them for your daughters, nor shall you give your daughters to their sons, for they would turn your sons away from following me, so that they may serve other gods. It wasn't prejudice, it was protection. It wasn't limitation, it was freedom. But Solomon, in his wisdom, believed he could control the consequences of his choices. Each woman who entered the palace brought with her not only beauty and culture, but gods. Astarte, Milcom, Chemosh, names that began to echo in the corridors of the same palace where once only the name of the Lord could be heard. Altars began to be erected on the hills surrounding Jerusalem, not to the God of Israel, but to pagan deities. What began as international diplomacy has turned into Solomon's idolatry. The man who had built the most glorious temple to God was now building altars to idols. The king who had prayed publicly to the Lord was now secretly burning incense to strange gods. King Solomon's mistakes. These were no longer small strategic lapses. They were spiritual betrayals that were eroding the very foundation of his kingdom. And the most tragic thing is that he probably believed he could serve God and idols simultaneously, that his wisdom was sufficient to balance light and darkness. But God was watching every move, every choice, every commitment, and preparing to act. God's wrath is not like human wrath. It doesn't explode without warning, nor does it act on impulse or uncontrolled emotion. It is just, measured, and inevitable. And when it began to manifest itself in Solomon's life, it revealed a truth few leaders understand. Wisdom that brought consequences can be more dangerous than sincere ignorance. Because this has happened to you, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. God's words echoed in Solomon's heart like thunder from a clear sky. The wisest man in the world had committed the oldest folly of humanity, believing he could circumvent spiritual laws. Consequences of King Solomon began to manifest like ripples on a lake. First, Hadad the Edomite rose up as an adversary in the south. Then Rezon, son of Eliada, caused trouble in the north. But the most painful blow came from within. Jeroboam, his own servant, received a promise from a prophet that he would reign over 10 tribes of Israel. The kingdom David had unified with blood, sweat, and tears was poised to fall apart, and all because of the choices of a king who had the wisdom to solve everyone's problems except his own. Solomon and God's discipline became a living lesson on how divine blessings do not exempt us from the consequences of our choices. The ironic thing is that Solomon probably managed to analyze each crisis with his extraordinary wisdom. He could understand politically why enemies rose up, why the people murmured, why his kingdom was destabilizing. But the one thing his wisdom couldn't do was undo the choices that had created this entire situation. Sometimes understanding the problem isn't enough to solve it. It was like watching a giant collapse in slow motion. Solomon's spiritual decline, it didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible process that began with small compromises and ended with a divided nation. The man who had begun his reign seeking God in dreams now rarely consulted him. The king who had prayed publicly for divine wisdom now trusted his own intelligence more than the guidance of the Most High. Why was God angry with Solomon? Becomes clear when we understand that it wasn't just idolatry, it was abandonment. Solomon's final years were marked by a painful contradiction. Externally, Israel was still prosperous, still respected, still envied by neighboring nations. But internally, spiritual cracks were turning into political chasms. The people began to grumble about heavy taxes, forced labor, and a king who seemed more interested in impressing foreign queens than caring for his subjects. When Solomon died, he took with him not only a golden age, but also national unity. His son Rehoboam ascended the throne, but lacked his father's wisdom to maintain unity. The 10 northern tribes rebelled and crowned Jeroboam king, fulfilling the prophecy God had given years before. The kingdom that had been the pride of the ancient world fragmented into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And it all began with a wise king who believed he could serve two masters at once. The division was not merely political, it was the physical reflection of a spiritual division that had begun in Solomon's heart long before. Sometimes the greatest national tragedies begin with the smallest personal betrayals. 3,000 years have passed, but lessons from the life of Solomon continue to be written every day in the lives of people around the world. Leaders who start out well but become corrupted by power. Wise people who make foolish decisions. Blessed individuals who lose everything because of small commitments that become big problems. The first lesson is disturbing. Wisdom without character is dangerous. Solomon had the knowledge to solve any problem, but he lacked the moral strength to resolve his own internal conflicts. He could discern between two mothers fighting over a baby, but he couldn't discern between God's will and his own desires. The second lesson is even more challenging. God's blessings are not immunity from the consequences of our choices. Solomon had divine wisdom, unimaginable wealth, and international peace. But when he chose to disobey God, not all his wisdom was enough to avoid the consequences. Spiritual privilege increases responsibility, not diminishes it. Solomon's wisdom and fall teaches us that the greatest danger lies not in the great, obvious temptations, but in the small, seemingly harmless compromises. No one wakes up one day and decides to destroy their life. It's always a gradual process, one small detour, then another, until you look back and no longer recognize who you've become. Solomon's legacy. It's complex because it's real. He was neither saint nor devil, he was human, extraordinarily blessed, incredibly wise, yet still human, with all the frailties that entails. And perhaps that's precisely why his story still resonates with us today, because we see in it a reflection of our own struggles between what we know is right and what we want to do. And we have come to the end of this extraordinary journey through the life of the wisest man who ever lived. Solomon in biblical history is not just the story of a powerful king. It is a mirror in which each of us can see ourselves reflected. It is the story of how even the most blessed can fall if they lose sight of what truly matters. The revelation I promised at the beginning now becomes clear. The greatest wisdom in the world is useless unless accompanied by humility and obedience to God. Solomon had everything the world considers success: wealth, power, knowledge, international fame. But when he lost his connection with God, he also lost the ability to use all this wisdom constructively. Wisdom of Solomon in the Bible teaches us that the true test of our maturity is not what we achieve when we have little, but what we do when we have much. How would you react if God gave you unlimited wisdom? How would you handle extraordinary wealth? How would you behave if people from all over the world came to seek your advice? The difference between human wisdom and divine wisdom lies precisely here. Human wisdom teaches us how to get what we want. Divine wisdom teaches us to want what we ought to get. Solomon had access to both, but gradually chose to rely more on the former than the latter. But there is hope in this story. Even when God disciplined Solomon, he did not abandon him completely. Even when the kingdom divided, David's line continued. Even when wisdom became corrupt, Solomon's true words remained to bless future generations. Because God is greater than our mistakes, more faithful than our betrayals, more patient than our failures. Solomon's story ends, but its lesson remains. True wisdom is not in having all the answers, but in keeping your heart connected to the one who is the source of all wisdom. It is not in impressing the world, but in pleasing God. It is not in hoarding blessings, but in using those blessings to bless others. May your story be different. May your choices honor not only your intelligence, but also your faith. And may you never forget, wisdom without responsibility is the quickest path to destruction, but wisdom with obedience is the surest path to a life worth living.